So I want to say a bit, I guess, about how the current crisis potentially is going to impact trans people. So, for example, I just sort of thought of a few things off the top of my head. One of them is because we're confined now to to our homes, most of us, the vast majority of us are in our homes, particularly obviously those who are in vulnerable situations. People are not able to follow up on their appointments. We know that all non-essential surgery, all non-essential appointments have been cancelled. And again, put that in context for trans people. Some trans people who have been referred to gender identity clinics have been waiting literally years to get appointments and to be to be referred, to be assessed, and to access treatment of some sort or another. And that for vast majority of trans people now is going to be put on hold for the foreseeable future. And that has enormous impact on people's state of mental health and mental well-being. Um, you know, it's something that perhaps in current circumstances people might not consider, but it is a big issue when you think about the way in which an awful lot of trans people, the majority of trans people, are socially marginalised in one form or another. Um, very high levels of unemployment, often estranged from their families without the support networks that other people may be able to depend on. And so, that's a serious factor. There's the worry of people's access to medication. I don't know if people were aware, but last year there was, there were serious. I'm not sure there were shortages, but there were problems in terms of the supply of HRT, for example, for menopausal women, and because the medication is very similar for many trans women. Again, that was a problem. They were having to wait to get medication, to access it, and you begin, if you don't get it, you begin to worry about the impact of withdrawal from that, etc., etc. So those, it's another factor. And there's a broader general one, of course, which is that you may be aware in the UK in particular, the issue of trans rights and trans lives has led to really a considerable moral panic. Really, that's the truth of it, and a reaction to the proposals to make changes to the Gender Recognition Act. I think that's one of the reasons why it's been a particular focus here, whereas it perhaps isn't in some other countries. I'm not saying there's not, serious transphobia in other countries, but it hasn't got the same focus as it has in the UK. And the government has been sitting on a consultation report that they started consultation in 2017. That ran through to 2018. It was supposed to report in early 2019, and it still hasn't reported. And it's unlikely to now for some time. So the whole issue of proposed changes to the Gender Recognition Act, which include the really so-called controversial one of making the application for a gender recognition certificate easier and more straightforward and based on a self-declaration process instead of the cumbersome medicalized process that currently exists. All that, which people were hoping there was going to be a report on and recommendations on, is now very much in the long grass. And people are pretty much aware, trans people are pretty much aware that there's been a huge amount of lobbying by trans critical organisations and individuals and transphobic organisations and individuals to try and persuade the government not to pursue those changes. It's actually gone quite a lot further than that now, in that some of those groups have turned their sights on the Equality Act or aspects of the Equality Act of 2010, which also give rights to trans people, and to find a way of making it harder and more difficult for trans people to use gender appropriate facilities, single sex facilities in particular. And that's been ramped up and is being increasingly ramped up by trans critical and transphobic people. So although most of this attack is clearly coming from the right. You know, I don't think we should pretend that it's mostly coming from the left or from radical feminists. Actually, most of it's coming from the right, from the people who actually hate diversity. You know, the Trumps of this world, the Viktor Orbáns in Hungary of this world, the Bolsonaros of this world, who want to roll back the gains that all sorts of oppressed groups, not just LGBT plus people, but all sorts of oppressed groups have made in all sorts of places over the last 30 or 40 years. They want to roll that back. They hate multiculturalism. They hate diversity. They hate migrants. They hate Roma people. They hate LGBT people. They want to roll back the rights of women in terms of reproductive rights and so on. And you can see that process, you know, gaining pace ever since, for example, Donald Trump uh, took office in 2017. Well, the first thing that Donald Trump did was to try and ban Muslim people from entering the USA from certain countries. The second thing, I think pretty much the second thing he did, was to ban trans people from the American military. And, you know, probably a lot of people on this meeting tonight are not great fans of the American military. I'm certainly not. But actually, you know, when you think about, well, why would trans people join the military? One of the reasons is if you come from a deprived background, it's a form of economic economic conscription, because you know if you go in, you'll be trained mostly in some kind of skill that you might be able to use. But also, if you're trans, actually, you are then subject to, you're part of a healthcare plan. And that healthcare plan may not be available to you outside of the armed forces. You know, if you can't get a kind of well-paid and secure job, you're probably on a minimal plan with insurance companies that won't actually support you in your transition. Okay, so you won't get it. But in the armed forces, you kind of would. I worked out when I was writing the book, because one of the objections to this that Trump and others raised was of trans people in the military was it costs too much for the medical care of trans people. And when you think about how many trans people there are in the military, which is actually not that many, you know, proportionately, you've got a military with literally hundreds of thousands of people in it. I worked out that the cost of care for trans people in the American military was about the equivalent of half a wing of one of the new F-5 fighter bombers that they've got on order, the 95 fighter bombers that they've got on order to go and bomb, you know, parts of the world where they want to continue to keep the American military as top dog. You know, it's minimal, absolutely minimal. So it's actually very much about, you know, a political program. It's not about saving costs or anything like that. So much, as I say, most of the attack is coming from those people who are ideologically opposed to equality of women, to equality of LGBT people, and who are, you know, who support traditional family values, etc., and basically support capitalism going on as it is now. And you know, that's very, very dangerous for all of us who are in vulnerable and marginalised groups, and for the working class in general. However, having said that, it's also clear that there actually is quite a long tradition of some radical feminists being hostile to trans rights, and particularly to trans women's rights. It goes right back actually to the 1970s and the 1980s. You know, there were publications then intended to undermine the rights that trans people had. And we know, for example, that even very early on in the emergence of the gay liberation front and the gay liberation movement after Stonewall in 1969, very early on, by the early 70s, there was pressure from the more, what should we say, the kind of the safer elements of the gay liberation movement to marginalize, to isolate, and to reject those who are seen as more radical or unacceptable to bourgeois society. So, you know, the more radical gays, for example, and trans people were often pushed to the sidelines. And certainly two of the key activists of the time that people may know of, and who are actually on the cover of the book, Sylvia Rivera and Marcia Johnson, who were founder members of the Gay Liberation Front, and also, fantastic activists in terms of trying to help young, very often homeless, trans and non-binary people and young gay people to have some sort of home and some sort of support. They were squeezed out often of the movement. And there's a famous, if you've not seen it, there's a very famous and incredibly moving speech by Sylvia Rivera, which you can find on Facebook. It's called "You'll Better Quiet Down." You'll Better Quiet Down, and it's Sylvia Rivera at the 1973 Pride rally after the Pride March in New York. The first Pride was in 1970, so this was the kind of second or third one along. And they denied her the microphone. She had to fight her way onto the platform to get hold of the microphone to speak up for trans people. And she makes the most incredible, angry, moving speech, which I think is, every time I hear it, it puts the hairs back up, up on the back of my neck. It's really worth looking at, because it was a cry of anger and anguish that there was a whole set of people who were being squeezed out of the kind of homonormative movement as it was emerging, because they were seen as too radical, too beyond the pale. And there was a whole kind of reformist strategy developing at the time to try and win seats in local government in America and so on and so forth, to sort of play ball with the establishment. The retreat from the struggles of the 60s, out of which the gay liberation movement and Black Power movement and so on had emerged. And that retreat was into a form of reformism. Let's try and win seats in the local government, etc., and win sort of basic reforms. Nothing wrong with actually fighting and winning reforms, by the way. But if you want to, the argument in the book very much is, if you want trans liberation, or you want any sort of liberation, true liberation, you will not get it within the capitalist system as it exists. You will not get it in the capitalist system. You will not get it in a class society. And in order to make that argument, I kind of go back to try and explain where the roots of trans oppression and transphobia come from. And it is, when you look back, it is about the emergence of class society. It's about the way in which classes, once you get a bit of a surplus, agricultural surplus, merchant surplus, and so on, you have some wealth, and you get a small wealthy group of people emerge who want to make sure that the wealth that they've stolen off everybody else through their labor or through plunder actually goes to their own family, their own class, their own mates, and so on. And if they're going to do that, they have to make sure that the paternity of their children is assured. And so you get more and more controls on women's behavior, on women's sexual behavior, for example. You get more and more restrictions and punishments for adultery. You get the emergence of male dominance and so on. And alongside that oppression of women, you also get much more strict control about people's sexual behavior and their gender expressions. And so you find, whereas in much older pre-class societies, some of which have survived through as hunter-gatherer societies into modern life, trans people and non-binary people are not seen as people who should be oppressed or suppressed. They're often regarded as valuable members of society, as part of normal humanity. Different forms of sexuality are there. It's when you get the emergence of rigid class societies and the social relations that emerge, social relations of production and reproduction, where it's focused on being within the nuclear family model, and this whole notion of male dominance, female subservience, and lack of power, which is associated also, as I say, with different forms of sexuality and so on. So in the book, what I've tried to do is to look at some of that history, the emergence of different forms of sexuality. I've tried to look at for the history of just the emergence of trans identities, if you like, from homosexuality, because up until the 20th century they were kind of lumped together, just under the kind of notion of homosexuality. Really, it only really emerged as a, as something different and separate from sexuality, really from the second quarter, I guess, of the 20th century. And I've tried to look at the link between the left, the growth or the emergence of socialists and socialist organisation in the late 19th century, early 20th century, with the emergence of open demands for LGBT rights, for the decriminalisation, for example, of homosexuality. And you find out, that those demands go hand in hand with demands for the liberation of women, the votes for women, women's suffrage, and so on. And a whole number of individuals. Edward Carpenter was a member of the early socialist organisations. A whole series of other people who raised those demands within their emerging socialist organisations. Some in Germany, some in Britain, some elsewhere. And these are demands which are very much associated with the left. The best example, actually, is actually the Russian Bolshevik Party. Lenin talked about a revolution being the festival of the oppressed and the exploited. Any revolution is the festival of the oppressed and the exploited. When suddenly people feel through the struggle that they actually have some hope of changing the situation that they're in and some possibility of doing that collectively, with other people. And the Russian Revolution, the only and first successful socialist revolution in 1917, one of the first things that the revolutionaries did when they actually gained power and beat back, got rid of the Tsar and got rid of the bourgeois government and so on, they made a whole series of changes which were fantastically important for women, but they also decriminalised homosexuality, and they introduced a new penal code in 1922, just like 5 years after the revolution, which was based on the notion that the state has no business interfering in anybody's sex life or in anybody's sexual behavior or gender expression, as long as that behavior causes no harm to anybody else. It is not the business of the state, who you sleep with, who you love, how you express yourself. And that is absolutely fundamental. And it seems to me it's a key kind of demand or a principle that we should be putting forward now. The state has no business in these issues of bodily autonomy, bodily expression, our love, and so on and so forth. Now, unfortunately, we know that by the late 1920s, early 1930s, that process had gone into reverse. It had gone into reverse in Russia because of the rise of Stalinism, but unfortunately, even in Germany, which had one of the first, actually the first sex institute from the first quarter of the 20th century. Actually, it was in that institute where the first gender reassignment operations were carried out. It's not true that they were carried out in America. The first ones were not carried out in America in the 1950s. They were carried out in Germany in the 1920s and 1930s, actually. Not a vast number of them, but they were in the institute in Berlin. And that also was rolled back with the rise of the Nazis by the early 1930s, and that institute was destroyed. And all the records were burnt and so on and so forth, and lots of its practitioners were murdered, and of course lots of LGBT people ended up either in the concentration camps or in the prisons in Germany under the Nazis, and were terrorized into subordination. And by the way, a lot of those people who were locked up by the Nazis in the 1930s and the 1940s were still in jail and still in prison in Germany in the Federal Republic in the 1950s. They were still there because they weren't released when the Nazis were defeated in 1945. The government didn't remove the statute that allowed LGBT people and trans people and so on to be rounded up and stuck in jail, and often worked to death and experimented on to death. So that went on even afterwards. Now, unfortunately, that that sort of strand of Stalinism on the left persisted through the war and in some of the mass organizations, the mass socialist organizations after the war as well. The mass communist parties. still had this idea somehow that to struggle for or to support the rights of LGBT plus people was a diversion from the real class struggle. It was a a bourgeois diversion, and that really what you had to do was concentrate on questions of pay, on conditions at work, etc., etc., and not on these kind of bourgeois issues of the rights of oppressed minorities like gay people and trans people and lesbians and so on. It wasn't really until the emergence. There were exceptions to that, by the way. I'm not saying every socialist influenced by the Communist parties thought the same, but by and large that was the case. And it wasn't until the emergence of the new left from the 1960s onwards that those attitudes were challenged significantly on the left. And actually, the SWP's predecessor, the International Socialists, and the SWP in its early years as well in the 70s actually has a very good record of supporting um, lesbian and gay rights. Tony Cliff, who was the founder of what is now the Socialist Workers' Party, wrote a landmark article in Socialist Worker in 1978, I think it was, saying why socialists must support gay rights. And that was not hugely common on the left at the time. And I think those of us in that tradition can be proud of having taken that position. So as I say, I've spent some time in the book looking at the links between the left, the fight in the labour movement, and the trade unions for LGBT rights, trans rights, and so on. It's been a long fight, but actually, it is important that most trade unions nowadays support LGBT plus rights, and most trade unions quite clearly support trans rights as well. And that's important because there is going to be, major fights over trans rights into the future, because you can be sure that in all this crisis, the coronavirus crisis and so on, that's going on, many things may well have been shut down, but I can tell you, racism hasn't been shut down. Anti-Roma sentiment has not been shut down. Anti-Semitism has not been shut down, and neither has transphobia been shut down. There was an article in the Times just, I think, yesterday or the day before, by a notorious trans-critical, transphobic journalist, which attacked the Mermaids, which is the trans and non-binary children's charity, attacked it for so-called safeguarding issues, or not safeguarding issues, for encouraging children to be able to keep their questioning about their gender secret, private from their parents, who might well be transphobic. And there was an attack on its charitable status and so on. And that's nothing new. These attacks have been coming thick and fast over the last 3 or 4 years. In the period that I started writing the book to when it got published, it got much, much worse in terms of the kind of articles that were being promoted, the kind of myths and wrong information, scaremongering information that's put about without being properly, the evidence has not been properly tested, and it gets regurgitated by mass media and so on without really being checked. The truth of it is actually that I did search through all sorts of media when I was writing the book. We're told that trans women are inherently going to be a danger to natal women, to cisgender women, for example, in public toilets or mixed hospital wards or women's hospital wards or in prisons or changing rooms, swimming bars and so on. I mean, the evidence for this is absolutely minimal. There are literally 1 or 2 cases in this country, literally 1 or 2 cases. Actually, the people who tend to suffer from these kind of attacks and these kind of claims are trans women themselves, who then find themselves being harassed and attacked and so on when they try and use those facilities, which many of us have been using for decades without any problems. And also cisgender women who don't somehow conform appropriately to feminine gender stereotypes, who have short hair or who don't look female enough yeah, not feminine enough, and they find themselves getting challenged in these situations as well. Which is just kind of just appalling. So as I say, that was one of the big purposes of the book. I've also tried to address the theoretical arguments that explain transphobia, um, and I've sort of looked at other forms of explanation, various identity theories, privilege theory, intersectionality theory, and so on. And I've I think the problem with all of those kind of theories that derive from identity politics is that they focus on essentially what divides us, on the characteristics of what divide us, and on individual characteristics, and on um, a strategy that says you change yourself, change yourself primarily, and rather than trying to change the whole society and the basis of the society in which we live, and to do that collectively. And I've tried to say, well, actually, if you start from a position that says the fundamental basis of capitalism is the extraction of profit from our labour, that's what it's there for. That's what it does. And anything that the ruling class thinks is going to make that harder to achieve will be subject to criticism, attack, and so on. Anything that they can do to divide our side when we try and combine together, to fight back against that exploitation or against those aspects of oppression like racism and so on. Anything that they can do to divide our side makes them more secure in their position and their wealth and their power. And our job, it seems to me, is any socialist job, is first of all to say that any socialist, any progressive person actually starts from a position of solidarity with any oppressed group, unconditional solidarity. And without doubt, trans people are a massively oppressed group. I know things have got better in all sorts of ways in certain countries. That's without doubt true. But actually, and I know also in this country, there is same-sex marriage, there is the Gender Recognition Act, there is the Equality Act, and so on. And I know that in some countries, clearly, to be trans or to be seen as trans is lethal. People are murdered. Hundreds of people are murdered every year for being transgender or non-binary. That is still the reality, and it is illegal, and you can be locked up for a long time simply for expressing your your gender identity in that way, and it clearly can lead to your murder on the streets, as happens to lots of people, every year. But the fact is that we got those gains through struggle. These weren't given to us. We've been able to struggle for them and fight for them. But at the end of the day, we're going to have to take the fight further. We have to recognise that we gain nothing unless we struggle for it. We will hang on to nothing in the current onslaughts from the right unless we organise together to do that. One of the messages in the book is that trans people and non-binary people are such a small proportion of the population, and we are, 1, 2, maybe 3% maximum. You can't achieve your own liberation and organize to win solely on the basis of autonomous organization of trans people. The organization is really important, for lobbying, for fighting, for supporting one another and so on. But actually, we have to work together with, with the working class in general. Fundamentally, we have to build a kind of movement that can challenge the whole basis of the society. You can only do that by mass movement, and that means looking towards working with supporters, working together, combining our struggles around. There's no. One of the things we should be fighting, for example, is we should say, look, why do a group of trans-critical feminists turn on trans people as somehow being the main enemy, in a situation where 10 years of austerity has decimated domestic violence refuges, for example? 75% of the funding's gone, loads have had to close, they're having to turn people away. But they're also turning away trans people. It's not, trans women are also being turned away. Where are trans women supposed to go? So the obvious answer, it seems to me, for any progressive or socialist to say, actually, it's a common fight. A fight for women's rights is also a fight for trans rights. A fight for trans rights is also a fight for women's rights. They're not opposed to each other. And I think we have to push that argument of unity really, really strongly. Why do I think it's got, there's a group, of people who on, in other ways, we would stand alongside. A lot of the women, for example, some of the kind of radical feminist or transcritical women are people who have got very good approach on fighting racism. They're good, solid trade unionists, for example. Why do I think that I think it's because of the low level of struggle in this country in recent times, right? Up to now, actually. When you think that last year, something like 66, 66%, 2/3 of all the strike days lost, right, were accounted for by one small union, the University and College Union. One small union, right, which has 120 odd thousand members. Now that's great for us. And I'm a UCU member. That's great for us. We can go, yes, bloody hell, aren't we great? But actually, we are pretty great, actually. But what about the rest of the union movement? What about the big battalions? Where have they been when 130,000 extra deaths have been caused by by the austerity measures pushed by the Tories since 2010? They've not really been anywhere at all. And I think that low level of struggle is a reflection and also a cause of a level of pessimism amongst sort of lower level of the bureaucracy in the trade union movement, which is where a lot of the people, for example, some of those people who set up Women's Place UK, one of the more notorious organisations in my view, that's where they're rooted. Yeah, they're rooted in that level of sort of pessimism, inability to see how you can generate a real fight, and so on and so forth. And I think that's kind of, that's one of the reasons why it comes from that group of people. And I have to say, it's not good. You look at the Morning Star, which is the daily paper of the old part of the old Communist Party, and its attitude is pretty awful. Actually, it is transphobic towards people, towards trans people. There was a disgusting cartoon in the Morning Star just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, which wouldn't have looked out of place in the Daily Mail or even, frankly, in a far-right newspaper. It was absolutely appalling, and there was a storm of resistance and opposition to it, including open letters and so on and so forth, and they were forced to apologise. But it's that milieu that they develop. So I want to finish, really. I think I've been talking way too long, but I'll finish on this, that pretty fundamentally, the argument is, if you really want to fight for trans liberation, if you really believe that we need to fight for the liberation of all oppressed people, then you have got to question actually the nature of the society, the class society in which we live. And that raises the question about, how do you do this? How do you best take the fight to those people who run the society, to the ruling class now? And it has to be through working class mass action, because through that action we're able to more effectively defend the reforms that we have now, the rights that we have now, but also push forward to gain more rights. But also it builds the confidence, the mass confidence of the working class in general, makes us more able to challenge the whole nature of the system. That's actually what the coronavirus crisis is doing. People are having to question the whole nature of capitalism. We've just seen the renationalisation of the railways, at the stroke of a pen, the click of a finger, or whatever. They're having to socialize systems of distribution and so on. And many people will draw the right conclusions from this, which is that, well, why don't we do that all the time? Why don't we have that system all the time? We can fight for that, and we can fight for a better world. And just to finish, I'll read you the last paragraph in the book. There is good stuff elsewhere in the book, by the way. It's worth reading the whole thing, I think, and not just the last paragraph. But there you go. The last paragraph is this: in a socialist world where production will be organised for need and not for profit, and where the nuclear family and all its pervasive ideological underpinnings will no longer be the sole incubator and primary socializer of the current and next generation of labour. Many different gender expressions, sexualities, and creative humane arrangements for living together will be possible. For trans and non-binary people, as for all the oppressed and exploited, such a socialist society is the prize worth fighting for. So I'll finish it there. Thanks for listening.